We are a worldwide congregation. We're a worldwide Redemptorist family. I don't know why. Sometimes I wonder what it is about Redemptorists that seems to attract so many laymen and women to want to give their time freely. Pope Francis's insight has changed, I think, forever the way we will do and prepare for our general chapters. These are not just a general chapter of the professed Redemptorists. A real major challenge for us is that we cannot lose our closeness to the poor. For me, the image of the Most Holy Redeemer that has always captivated me most is the image that we find in Isaiah, that it really means when we call God Redeemer, the God who is closer to us than our nearest blood relative.
Father Michael Brehl, Superior General, is with us in the studio the Scala News. Good morning, Father Michael.
Good morning, Gregory.
Thank you for accepting invitation to talk about the very important event that is before us soon. I mean, we are preparing to the general chapter. So I would ask you a few questions regarding this preparation and also the situation of the congregation we are now. So you, Father General, you are taking part in the phase 1 of the preparatory meetings to the general chapter. What are your experiences?
For me, as general, and I think for any superior general, the best part of this ministry is actually when we leave Rome and we go and we meet the confreres and our lay partners in mission in different parts of the world. So my first reflection on the experience is that after more than 2 years without the ability to travel, going to these first phase meetings was a privilege and a joy just to meet the confreres and the lay partners. That was the first thing. Secondly, it wasn't easy traveling and it wasn't easy scheduling these meetings because of the pandemic. We actually had to change plans a number of times. But once the meetings began, everybody was fully engaged in what we were about. And to be able to talk to people from all over the world, from 80 different countries, to be able to listen to Redemptorists and lay people was an extraordinary experience. So the 5 meetings began with Africa, Madagascar, which unfortunately had to be online due to the Omicron variant. They couldn't travel. And then we continued with Europe, with North America, with Latin America, with Asia and Oceania. Every meeting was different, but every meeting was quite extraordinary in its own right. More people participated in this general chapter, which has already begun with the first phase, than ever before. In total, we had 250 people at the 5 meetings. 11 of those people were lay partners. There were more who could have come, except that travel was not possible for a few of them. We'd hoped to have 15. We had 16 brothers among the delegates and participants in these meetings, and that too was extraordinary. So it was really a very, very powerful and positive experience.
You partially responded to my next questions. I would like to ask you in which way the pandemic situation affected the preparatory process. It really was the problem for...
It was a great challenge because the preparatory process began before the first phase meeting and normally involves bringing people together as we start with a questionnaire to the whole congregation. And that started in 2020, and we had to go ahead, even though it was impossible to travel. But we discovered something, and it was really a blessing, that because everybody was in lockdown, the local communities, which are supposed to respond to the questionnaire, were able to do so together easily because they were all home. And they all responded and sent everything back to the Central Preparatory Commission. Then the Commission had a brilliant idea that we should use Zoom and we should use videos and communicate using people from all over the congregation reflecting on their experience to, what would you say, animate the next set of preparatory meetings which took place in every province. That was really a worthwhile process, and the responses we got from people were extraordinarily helpful. In that sense, the pandemic offered us the possibility to be creative. We had to think differently and do it differently, and it made a difference. On the other hand, the Central Preparatory Commission and meeting with all the coordinators and the council together in person was not possible until the last week of June this year. The pandemic made that impossible, and that was really a limiting factor. Then we moved to the first phase meetings. Africa and Madagascar we had to conduct online. Even though it was part of our general chapter, fortunately, we had from the Vatican the authorization to have meetings online, even chapter, but we couldn't do elections. Well, elections don't take place in the first phase. So we could do the meeting for Africa and Madagascar online. They couldn't travel last January. The meeting went extraordinarily well. It was not easy. It was extremely tiring for them and for us. Sometimes we had problems with connections, but people participated generously and gave it their best. It really called something extra out of us in terms of being creative. We had to postpone the meeting for Asia-Oceania from February until June, which was a struggle because I have to go to Wall 5, and this meant that I had to go from one meeting to another at the end with no break in between, traveling across the globe. That was not easy, but in the end it was worthwhile. The pandemic also affected us because in the 4 meetings that we had in presence, the possibility of somebody being positive for COVID was always there. At the end of the Europe meeting, we had one person positive at the meeting and several who became positive or tested positive just as they returned home. Probably it initiated in our meeting here in Rome. At the meeting in Latin America, we had 13 who tested positive just towards the end of the meeting, and they had to participate with Zoom from their rooms, but many more of us contracted the virus before the end. In fact, I became positive on the very last day of the meeting when I was supposed to travel that night to North America. So I had to participate in the first week in North America by Zoom, which is very difficult when everybody else is present and you're listening in like a fly on the wall. But we made it work, thanks to the real efforts of the people conducting the meeting in North America. A special thanks to Kevin O'Neill in Santo Arrigo and Jack Kingsbury, who made it possible. Fortunately, I became negative in time to arrive for the second week of the meeting in North America, just as 2 people in that meeting tested positive. So COVID touched every one of our meetings in one way or another. Asia-Oceania, nobody tested positive during the meeting, thank God. But it had to be postponed, and everybody had to change plans. Another thing that affected our meetings was violence and war. The war in Ukraine prevented the delegates from Ukraine coming and participating in person. And there were to be 3 of them from Ukraine. So they had to participate online, but they could only do it twice during the whole meeting, at the beginning and end. The trouble in Sri Lanka that we're hearing about now prevented the 2 delegates from Sri Lanka arriving on time. And so they only got there late. And difficulties with visas from Cuba, because of the situation there, meant that the delegate from Cuba couldn't get to Latin America. So it wasn't only COVID that affected us, but for the first time since the end of the Cold War, since the wall fell in Europe, we couldn't have the full number of delegates in a meeting due to war and problems like this. So it's good to remember that there are other factors in our wounded world which really touch our lives, our processes, our plans. And then we have to find other ways of making the meetings as effective as we can for the sake of the mission.
We have also important processes in the church, universal church.
Yes.
The Redemptorists General Chapter is celebrated parallelly to the important event, which is Synod of Synodality. How the synodal process is being reflected in the, as we prepare for the canonical phase of the General Chapter.
That's a very good question, and I think a very important one. In 2016, Pope Francis first started talking about the Synod in 3 phases. That was just 7 years after we had already decided to do the General Chapter in 3 phases. And in 2016, we were actually conducting for the first time the General Chapter following this kind of a process, with a phase in each continent, with the assembly of the whole body together in the canonical phase, and then returning to the continents so that we can apply the decisions of the General Chapter locally in different cultures and contexts. When Pope Francis convoked this synod on synodality, he added a very special dimension which has increased the consultation process in the whole church, that we are to walk together with the largest number of people possible, contributing their voices to how we respond to the challenges to be church in a synodal manner today. We've tried in this preparation for the General Chapter to imitate this addition that Pope Francis brought in our whole consultation and preparation process, involving not only the confreres in every community in the congregation, which means in more than 700 communities across the world, in more than 80 countries. But we encourage them to also engage in their preparation and consultation process with our lay partners, with religious sisters who share our charism. And I'm really delighted to say that never have so many lay partners and religious sisters participated in our preparation process as this time, even during a pandemic. Pope Francis's insight that the voice of God and the Holy Spirit speaks through all of us when we walk together and create a space for real dialogue. That means both speaking and listening to one another. That insight has changed, I think, forever the way we will do and prepare for our general chapters. These are not just a general chapter of the professed Redemptorists. They're an opportunity for us to engage not only with one another as brothers, but also to engage much more deeply with the people among whom and with whom we serve, with the sisters who share our charism, with the lay people who are called to be part of our family. So I think that this synodal process, which we're only beginning to discover how vital it is for us as a church, for us as a congregation, is another step on a journey that will lead us to more faithfully live our Redemptorist charism and our closeness to people today and in the coming decades.
One of the goals of the general chapter is also to evaluate, to see the current situation, to see how the congregation, how our congregation is fulfilling its mission. Can we a little bit talk about it, Father General? What dynamics you see in our congregation, and what can you describe our congregation, Redemptorist congregation today?
Well, first off, I would say that evaluation is absolutely vital to the success of any general chapter. And the process that led us through the consultation to our working document, which helped us in the first phase to evaluate our situation in the world, was really a work of great creativity, but also real listening to the voice of God and the signs of the times. The Commission identified listening to the voices that we heard reflected back to us from confreres, from men and women, from lay people, from sisters. They distinguished two different dimensions that need to be taken account in this evaluation. The world in which we're living today, the wounded world that we recognize so well after the pandemic, as we live in this period of wars which are affecting every continent, violence, the economic conditions, the crisis of the climate, those external factors to our congregation, over which we have very little control, but that's the world in which we're living, has to be evaluated in order for us to respond in fidelity to our charism. And the second is for us to look at the dynamics within the congregation, the internal structures and the internal challenges that we face as a congregation. I think when you ask about the dynamics taking place among us as Redemptorists and as a Redemptorist family, I would like to highlight, I could probably talk for a few hours, but that's not the purpose of this interview. I could probably highlight a couple of dynamics which are really building on our strengths as a worldwide congregation. First of all, we are a worldwide congregation. We're a worldwide Redemptorist family. We're international and intercultural. The charism of our congregation is not tied to any one culture, language, or experience. This diversity is a challenge, yes, but we are learning to see this diversity as a richness which helps us enter into a real dialogue and witness in the wounded world with gifts that perhaps we were not fully aware of before. Even in our ministry among migrants, because the world in which we live is a world that is experiencing a mass movement of peoples like it has not seen in many, many centuries. That diversity and appreciation of it is an important dynamic we need to celebrate as Redemptorists. It is a strength for us and not just a challenge. When we are part of one family and recognize that Redemptorists who have been formed and grown up in Asia don't think the same way as Redemptorists who've been formed and grown up in Europe, we can see that as a problem, or we can see it as an opportunity to view the world from a different perspective than our own small, narrow context. Second dynamic, we are growing beyond the provincialism that has often marked us in the past, not only Redemptorists, but religious. When we become so linked to our nation, to our culture, that we see this as the only or best way of doing things, then we miss the richness that God has placed in the hearts, in the lives, in the cultures and languages of so many other people. And we don't learn from one another. So a second dynamic that is taking place among us is a deeper appreciation of the way in which God is calling us beyond our small identity to the bigger worldwide identity. How does this take place? Well, there has been a growth, a huge growth in common formation, which means that from the very beginning, our younger members are initiated into a congregation alongside people from other cultures, other languages, other nations. And in that common formation, begin to discover the identity as Redemptorists which makes us truly one family. That common formation is starting to grow beyond the initial formation of our novices, seminarians, brothers in temporary vows, lay partners in mission when they start, into an ongoing formation that allows us to have encounters, and even Zoom, which we've discovered in the pandemic, makes this kind of thing possible, so that others who, like me, didn't have the opportunity for formation outside my culture and context when I was a student and a novice, now can engage in common ongoing formation with people from around the world. I was involved, along with a couple of members of the general government, in one of these ongoing formation opportunities in which we had more than 3,500 religious men and women, priests, brothers, sisters from all across the world, reflecting together on how do we care for minors and vulnerable adults once a month for a year. We can do this within the congregation. So this dynamic is really helping us to grow. A final dynamic I'll mention that is making a huge difference for us is our commitment to really engaging in partnership with lay men and women and with our sister congregations of women in carrying out the mission entrusted to us by the Holy Spirit through the church. That ministry and mission together in partnership opens doors for us that we couldn't have imagined a few years ago. And that is really a strength of our congregation. I don't know why. Sometimes I wonder what it is about Redemptorists that seems to attract so many lay men and women to want to give their time freely, some of whom have actually left their jobs and professions to volunteer full-time in mission with us. And sometimes we Redemptorists don't really appreciate what they bring and how they are calling us to move beyond our sometimes narrow identity, which can become very clerical. I'm not saying we've arrived as a congregation, but this is a strength that is building and growing within the congregation and on which we can rely. And we've got a resource in this partnership that will see us into the future and help us to become more and more faithful. So these dynamics, I think, indicate not only our strengths as a congregation, but they also indicate for us pathways into a future where God's voice is challenging us, calling us, and also supporting and strengthening us so that we can be really witnesses of the Redeemer in all that that means. Yeah, the congregation has a lot going for it as we enter this general chapter.
You have, General, a very rich experience visiting communities. During 2 terms as General Superior, you visited probably almost every community, Redemptorist community in the world. You met many conference lay partners. And what do you think about the future, the challenges the congregation we have to face? But this world of today is kind of unpredictable also. So this is the perhaps difficult to say, but in spite of that, we need to look at the future. In the future,
yeah. We do, and we're not exactly sure what the world will be calling us, or how God will be calling us in this world to respond in the next 10 years. But we have some signs, and there are challenges that are facing us. I had the joy of visiting almost every country where we're working. I was not able to go to a few places, a couple of which I really can't name because some of the problems that kept me from going were problems of political problems and getting visas. I didn't get to Uruguay. It was on my agenda, and I had the ticket to go there and to go to Chile, again to go to Chile, when the pandemic hit and the lockdown hit, and I won't get to Uruguay before the end of this sexennium. I regret that, and there were a few other places similar. Otherwise, I've been to, I think now it's 76 different countries in these 13 years, which I never imagined in my life would ever happen. I've been in so many communities, I've met so many people. Some of the challenges that are facing us. A real major challenge for us is that we cannot lose our closeness to the poor. If we lose our closeness to the poor, living among the poor, working with the poor, listening to the poor, learning from the poor, if we lose that, we will lose what is called the badge of our fidelity to our charism in our constitutions and statutes. And there's a danger that we could lose it. Because as we become more comfortable, as we grow, it becomes sometimes harder and harder for us to really be close to the poor. It's a challenge, it's a struggle. But we cannot lose that identity. We cannot lose this most important aspect of our faithfulness to the charism. We haven't. And as I've traveled the world, I have been wonderfully inspired by the work that we do with and among the poor. But a real challenge is not only doing ministry with and among the poor, but learning from the poor how God is calling us to be in the world today, living among the poor and sharing their lifestyle, which often means that we have to learn how to live with a greater insecurity, with less reliance on our own comfort. That's a real challenge to us Redemptorists. It's a real challenge to me personally, and I think it's a real challenge to our congregation. And we cannot stop talking about it, because if we do, we will let it go. Second challenge I think that is facing us, that I mentioned earlier, is to learn to appreciate and to see, to recognize our lay partners in mission as partners in the mission, called by virtue of their baptism, consecrated by the Holy Spirit in baptism and confirmation for ministry in the church. Too often, confreres can look on lay partners as the priest's helpers. So they do what we tell them. I have experienced, and I'm really impressed by this in different parts of the world, that sometimes we should be doing what they tell us. They have skills in areas that we don't have. They see things differently. I preached a mission with a lay woman in a community in the north of Canada, where many of the women in that community, who were the mainstays of their families and really held the whole community together, were suffering from abuse. They weren't going to talk to me about it as a man and the priest. They talked to her. She was able to speak to them, and she was able to bring the healing touch of Christ, which allowed them then to come to confession and receive absolution that they wouldn't have ever approached if I'd gone with a team of priests. So I think we need to appreciate what our lay partners can teach us about mission, about preaching, about evangelization, about witness, and respect them as partners, not helpers. Okay. I think that's a real challenge for us, and I think it's time that we grappled with it and took it seriously. Third real challenge for us, and this is a challenge for any congregation that has been as successful as the Redemptorists have been, spreading from a few men in the south of Italy to the whole world, all those countries I've mentioned. We are always being called, as Francis reminds us, the Holy Father, we are always being called to be a congregación en salida, a congregation going forth in mission, not settling into, as Constitution 1415 reminds us, settling into our surroundings, our churches, our shrines, where we're comfortable, but always going out, always seeking, as Jesus does, for the lost sheep, for the ones who are on the peripheries and the margins. So those are the challenges facing us. We've got a lot already in the congregation which can be a strength for addressing those challenges, but we can't close our eyes to them. And if we really want to respond to where God is calling us today, to where Jesus is calling us today, listen to the Holy Father, listen to the poor, listen to our lay partners, listen to the signs of the times in this wounded world, and then, as Pope Francis says, keep walking. Stand up and keep walking. Don't stay too settled. I think that's what I'd say in terms of challenge. I think we've got a great future. The other thing Pope Francis says, and he's quoting somebody else, I know, but I think when you talk about the future that we don't realize, Pope Francis always says, you make the path by walking. You discover the way by setting out. So, what will the future be? I'm not sure. But if we're walking and walking together, He'll be with us. and He'll make sure that we don't lose our way.
Thank you very much, Father General, for this conversation, for sharing your experiences, reflections. We will certainly accompany the general chapter, all the participants, not only listening and watching what is done, but also we are going to accompany them in prayer, by prayer. And as conclusion, I ask you at the end, in few days we will celebrate the Sunday of the Most Holy Redeemer. This is our patronate feast. What would you include in your prayer as you pray for the congregation on that day?
Well, for me, the image of the Most Holy Redeemer that has always captivated me most is the image that we find in Isaiah, that it really means, when we call God Redeemer, the God who is closer to us than our nearest blood relative. The God who is our Redeemer, Jesus, who is closer to us than our nearest blood relative. The Redeemer is about closeness. It's about relationship, so that we can save through relationship. My prayer for the congregation is that we will always remain close to the Redeemer who walks beside us, to the poor to whom He sends us, and to one another and to our lay partners, so that we can live as one missionary body in communion of mind and heart. I would only add to that, that in this communion, at the very heart of it, is always Mary, our Mother of Perpetual Help. Just as she was with the disciples in that upper room at Pentecost, she is in our midst when we live in communion with one another. And she's the great missionary, St. Alphonsus tells us, who sends us out and walks with us so that we can be witnesses to her Son, our Redeemer. So she'll be praying for our congregation, and she'll be praying for all of us as we enter this general chapter. I've absolutely no doubt of that. And with Mary beside us, walking with Jesus, we can't have any fear about where this will lead us.
Thank you again. Thank you so much, Father General.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.